Britain did not collapse when Rome withdrew. It simply stopped waiting, kept farming, repairing, breathing, adjusting quietly, while empire faded into background noise and ordinary days continued anyway, without supervision. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. A province without an exit scene. Britain was not informed that it had become post-Roman. There was no final announcement, no closing ceremony, no agreed moment when authority officially ended and something else began. What happened instead was a thinning. Roman coordination faded gradually, leaving behind roads, buildings, tools, habits, and expectations that no longer received reinforcement. Messages stopped arriving on time. Payments became irregular and then absent. Instructions grew vague and eventually disappeared. People did not debate what this meant. They noticed it through pauses, delays, and silences that slowly became normal. Life continued because it had to. Fields still demanded attention. Animals still required feeding and shelter. Tools still broke and needed repair. Winter still arrived on schedule, indifferent to administration. The absence of Rome did not interrupt seasons. It only removed the assumption that someone beyond the village would organize response, recovery, or replacement. What remained was land, labor, weather, and routine, and those elements were enough to keep days moving forward. Villages did not gather to declare independence or loss. They adjusted without language. A road went unrepaired one year, then another. A bathhouse cooled and stayed cold. A storehouse emptied and was not refilled. None of these changes arrived dramatically. They accumulated quietly, each small enough to ignore on its own. Over time, ignoring them became a skill. Attention narrowed to what still worked reliably. Roman buildings remained part of the landscape long after Roman authority stopped functioning. Stone walls still blocked wind. Roofed spaces still offered shelter. Roads still guided movement even when no one maintained them centrally. People used what remained useful and stopped engaging with what demanded too much effort. This was not rebellion. It was efficiency. Repairing a small structure made sense. Repairing something designed for an empire no longer did. There is mild irony in how calm this transition appears when viewed closely. Empires imagine endings as dramatic because they imagine themselves as essential. Ordinary life does not share that assumption. Farmers continued planting because hunger did not wait for clarity. Craftspeople continued working because broken tools did not care about politics. The province learned that survival did not require understanding what had ended. It required responding to what remained. Trade adjusted in similar fashion. Long-distance exchange weakened first. Locally produced goods became more important. Familiar routes replaced official ones. People traded with those they recognized rather than those who represented distant systems. Trust contracted but deepened. Smaller networks proved easier to sustain without oversight. This was not isolation. It was recalibration. Authority lingered in name longer than in effect. Some individuals retained titles, others retained responsibilities without support. Their influence softened. Decisions became advisory rather than enforceable. Communities listened out of habit, not obligation. Over time, habit replaced authority entirely. The transition was uneven and rarely discussed. Silence handled it. Children growing up during this period did not experience a fall. They experienced normality. Their world contained old structures, irregular maintenance, and routines shaped by weather and work. Stories of Rome existed, but they did not organize daily behavior. Memory without enforcement becomes background. Background rarely directs action. There is understated humor in how thoroughly Britain ignored the idea of an ending. Without an exit scene, there was nothing to react to. Life did not pause for reflection. It continued with small adjustments that accumulated into transformation. The absence of ceremony made the change easier to absorb. Roads illustrate this clearly. Roman roads did not vanish. They narrowed. Edges eroded. Maintenance became selective. Paths formed alongside stone where carts preferred softer ground. Movement followed practicality rather than design. The road remained present but altered, much like authority itself. Homes absorbed functions once handled publicly. Storage, repair, exchange, and decision-making moved inward. The village replaced the province as the scale of relevance. This was not celebrated. It simply worked. Smaller systems require less coordination and fewer assumptions. Britain learned this without instruction. Late-night history rests comfortably here because nothing insists on meaning. There is no declaration to analyze, no collapse to dramatize. Just continuation. A province without an exit scene does not announce transformation. It lives into it slowly, quietly, and effectively. By the time anyone might have named the change, it was already complete. Rome had not left suddenly. It had faded. Britain had not fallen. It had continued. And in that continuation, without supervision or explanation, daily life proved stronger than administration ever had. Roads that led nowhere in particular. Roman roads remained etched into the landscape long after the empire stopped speaking with confidence. They stayed straight, stubborn, and physically impressive, even as their purpose softened. Stone slabs continued to point outward toward horizons that no longer promised return. Travel did not vanish, but it narrowed its ambitions. Movement became local, deliberate, and cautious, as though distance itself had learned to mind its manners. The roads did not collapse in protest. They waited. Villages walked them as far as necessity required, and no further. Beyond that point, silence took over. These lines of stone had once demanded attention and labor across provinces. Now they accepted occasional footsteps without complaint. It was not failure. It was downsizing without paperwork. Late-night history notices how infrastructure can outlive intention, how confidence can remain physically present even after belief withdraws. The road stayed firm. The destination quietly resigned. In earlier centuries, roads insisted on purpose. They connected armies, markets, messages, and authority with a confidence that assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. After the fall, that assumption loosened. Roads continued to exist, but expectation did not. People no longer traveled because they were told to. They traveled because something nearby required attention. A relative, a repair, a seasonal exchange. Long routes became optional rather than essential. This change did not arrive with announcements or debates. It arrived through repetition. Fewer carts passed. Fewer hooves struck stone. Maintenance followed use instead of policy. Where feet returned regularly, stones were reset. Where they did not, grass learned new cracks. The road did not feel abandoned. It felt selectively remembered. That distinction matters. Forgetting implies loss. Selection implies judgment. Communities learned which distances still deserved effort, and which ones could rest undisturbed. Bridges tell this story especially well. Near villages, arches were reinforced, loose stones were replaced, water channels were kept clear enough to prevent surprise. Farther away, bridges waited. They did not demand repair simply because they existed. Without traffic, they remained suggestions rather than obligations. This was not ignorance. It was energy management. Repair requires tools, labor, and time. Time had become valuable in smaller increments. People invested it where return was immediate. A bridge that no one crossed did not compete well with roofs that leaked or fields that needed tending. The empire had once promised that everything connected mattered equally. After its silence, people disagreed politely by doing less. There is mild irony here. Roads built to assert control became lessons in restraint. They taught communities how to focus without apology. Travel changed character as well. Journeys shortened not because curiosity vanished, but because certainty did. A long road implies trust, that shelter, safety, and familiarity will appear along the way. That trust thinned. People preferred routes they already understood. Paths remembered by feet rather than maps regained importance. Roman roads did not disappear, but they lost monopoly. Side paths reemerged. Informal shortcuts mattered more than imperial precision. The straight line stopped being the fastest choice. It became merely the most obvious. Late-night history appreciates this demotion. Grandeur often assumes usefulness will follow automatically. These roads learned otherwise. Usefulness must be renewed constantly, or it becomes decorative. Stone can endure without meaning. Meaning requires participation. When participation shrank, roads adjusted quietly, remaining present, without insisting on relevance. There is understated humor in imagining these roads waiting patiently for traffic that never fully returned. Perfect alignment, durable materials, all prepared for a schedule that no longer existed. Yet they did not complain. They did not crumble dramatically. They simply aged. Lichens softened edges. Dirt settled between stones. The road blended into the land it once dominated. This blending was not erasure. It was reconciliation. Without constant movement, the road stopped interrupting the landscape and started cooperating with it. Farmers crossed it when needed. Children played along its edges. Animals treated it as another surface rather than a directive. Authority faded. Utility remained. That balance feels appropriate for a world that had grown cautious about large promises. The road no longer led to glory. It led to wherever someone needed to go that day. Maintenance followed this logic carefully. Villages did not feel responsible for distant stretches. Responsibility had shrunk to match influence. This was not apathy. It was realism. Repairing what you use makes sense. Repairing what symbolizes a past that no longer feeds you does not. The empire once maintained roads to project inevitability. Afterward, inevitability felt expensive. Communities maintained what returned value. This approach produced uneven results, but unevenness was preferable to exhaustion. A road repaired halfway still worked halfway. That was enough. Late-night history lingers here because this mindset contradicts modern obsession with completeness. Not everything needs to be fully restored to remain useful. Partial function can sustain life quietly without demanding perfection or nostalgia. The social meaning of roads shifted as well. They no longer represented access to power. They represented memory. People recognized where they went even if they no longer went there. The road became a reminder rather than a requirement. It suggested options without insisting on them. Walking along it could feel reflective rather than purposeful. You knew where it once led. You also knew why you stopped earlier now. That awareness did not feel tragic. It felt settled. Roads that led nowhere in particular still offered direction of a different kind. They showed how far certainty once reached and where it reasonably ended. In a quieter world, that knowledge mattered more than connectivity. It helped people gauge scale, ambition, and limits without needing explanation. Economically, this narrowing reduced risk. Long-distance travel exposes people to variables beyond their control. Short routes reduce surprise. After the fall, surprise was rarely welcome. Predictability became valuable. Roads close to home offered it. You knew who you might meet. You knew where you could rest. You knew when to turn back. The empire had encouraged movement for expansion. The post-imperial world encouraged movement for maintenance. That shift changed everything. Roads no longer chased opportunity. They supported routine. Routine stabilized days that might otherwise unravel. Late-night history recognizes routine as survival strategy rather than boredom. These roads supported that strategy quietly, asking only that someone walk them often enough to keep them visible. Over time, some roads vanished into fields. Others became boundaries. Some survived as nothing more than raised lines under grass, visible only in certain light. Yet their absence of traffic did not equal irrelevance. They shaped settlement patterns long after they stopped being used intentionally. Houses clustered near them. Paths followed their logic unconsciously. The empire's geometry lingered even when its authority did not. This persistence feels gently ironic. Control faded, but structure remained. The road did not care who used it or why. It accepted whatever role was offered next. That adaptability explains its survival better than any decree. Stone endures best when it stops insisting. Late-night history rests comfortably with these roads because they demonstrate a kind of intelligence that does not seek recognition. They were built confidently and then allowed to become modest. They did not demand upkeep beyond usefulness. They did not collapse in protest. They waited for footsteps and accepted silence when footsteps thinned. Roads that led nowhere in particular still led somewhere important. They led to a way of thinking smaller, choosing carefully, and conserving effort without shame. In the quiet after empire, this mattered more than speed or reach. The road remained straight. Life curved around it. And that compromise allowed both to continue without drama, explanation, or urgency, simply sharing space until night settled and movement slowed naturally again. Towns that grew quiet without closing. Former Roman towns did not disappear with a single decisive moment. They did not burn in one final gesture or empty themselves in a coordinated departure. They remained in place, stone by stone, street by street, while activity slowly withdrew from their edges. The change was gradual enough to feel almost polite. Walls continued to stand, roads still entered and exited, but the reasons for arriving changed, and so did the reasons for staying. The town did not collapse. It reduced its volume. Public buildings were often the first to lose relevance. Basilicas built for administration no longer hosted daily decisions. Offices, once filled with scribes and officials, grew quieter without protest. Documents stopped circulating. Notices stopped being posted. The buildings themselves did not react. They remained proportioned for authority that no longer required space. Echo replaced instruction. The architecture waited without expectation, still capable of function, simply uninvited. Markets followed a similar pattern. They did not shut down dramatically, they thinned. Stalls appeared less frequently, gaps opened between sellers. Exchange continued at a scale that matched trust rather than ambition. People still came to trade, but they came knowing exactly whom they were meeting. The market no longer promised variety. It promised reliability. That was enough. Noise softened. Urgency faded. Commerce adjusted its tone. Residential areas changed differently. Homes were not abandoned all at once. Families stayed until it made sense not to. Repairs were made selectively. Roofs were fixed when needed. Walls were patched when convenient. Empty houses remained standing, not yet ruins, simply unused. The town became uneven, lived in sections clustered near wells, churches, or familiar neighbors. Other streets waited quietly, neither reclaimed nor maintained. Silence filled space that activity had outgrown. There is mild irony in how calm this process appears from a distance. Modern imagination prefers collapse to be loud. It expects failure to announce itself clearly. These towns refused that narrative. They did not dramatize loss. They absorbed change by shrinking inward. They became smaller versions of themselves without declaring defeat. Late-night history notices how often endurance looks like withdrawal rather than resistance. Civic identity softened as well. Being from a town mattered less than being known within it. Reputation traveled shorter distances. Authority localized. Decisions were made face to face rather than through institutions. This did not require revolution. It required proximity. People trusted what they could see repeatedly. Large civic structures lost relevance not because people rejected them, but because daily life no longer passed through them often enough to justify attention. Public spaces changed tone before they changed form. Forums once designed for crowds hosted fewer conversations. Meetings happened at edges rather than centers. People crossed these spaces without lingering. The scale felt mismatched to need. Grandeur became awkward. Silence amplified size rather than diminishing it. Over time, grass appeared where feet no longer returned regularly. The space did not close. It became background. Religious buildings often remained active longer than administrative ones, but even they adjusted. Attendance fluctuated. Rituals simplified. Maintenance followed use. A church still mattered if people gathered there. If they did not, it became another large interior holding air and memory. This transition did not feel disrespectful. It felt practical. Buildings served people only as long as people served buildings in return. Infrastructure told the story quietly. Water systems continued to function in some areas and failed in others. Aqueducts feeding active neighborhoods were patched. Those serving empty districts were ignored. The town learned where life concentrated and adapted accordingly. This adaptation was not coordinated. It was cumulative. Each decision made sense locally. Together they reshaped the town's footprint without anyone needing to plan it. Movement patterns narrowed. People traveled shorter distances within towns. Paths between active areas became worn. Other streets faded. Direction simplified. You went where something still happened. The rest became optional. Towns did not need to be fully navigable to remain inhabited. Partial function proved sufficient. Late-night history appreciates this tolerance for incompleteness. Not everything needs to work everywhere all the time. There is understated humor in how official maps, would have lagged behind reality. On paper, the town remained intact. In practice, it had developed preferences. It favored certain corners. It ignored others. The discrepancy did not bother inhabitants. They lived in the version that responded. Formal completeness mattered less than lived usefulness. Economic activity followed people rather than structures. Workshops moved closer to homes. Crafts adapted to local demand. Specialized production declined where distribution networks failed. General skills became valuable. Those who could repair, reuse, or adapt materials found consistent work. The town's economy became quieter but steadier. Growth was no longer the goal. Continuity was. Social life concentrated. Familiarity increased. People knew who remained. Absence was noticed without being remarked upon. Empty houses became landmarks rather than losses. Children learned which streets mattered. Memory adjusted. The town did not forget itself. It edited itself. There is a calm discomfort in realizing that this process required no announcement. No one declared the town closed. No authority confirmed the change. It happened because behavior shifted. When behavior shifts long enough, structure follows. Towns respond to presence more than policy. Late-night history rests with this idea because it resists spectacle. It shows how complex systems can change direction without breaking. Towns grew quiet without closing because they did not insist on remaining what they had been. They allowed scale to match need. That permission prevented collapse. Over time, some towns stabilized at smaller sizes. Others continued thinning until only fragments remained occupied. A cluster of homes, a single church, a few workshops. Beyond that, stone held shape without use. These fragments were not failures. They were endpoints of adjustment. Life found its comfortable density and stopped pressing outward. Public memory adapted as well. Stories shifted from civic pride to personal continuity. People remembered who lived where rather than what the town once represented. Identity became local. This localization reduced pressure. One did not need to perform belonging to an empire. Belonging required recognition. There is light irony in how modern visitors sometimes mistake quiet for abandonment. Silence reads as absence to those accustomed to constant activity. But these towns were not empty. They were simply quieter than expectation. Life continued at a volume that suited conditions. Late-night history allows this quiet to feel sufficient. It does not ask for revival or restoration. It observes how towns can remain open without being loud, how walls can stand without hosting crowds, how places can continue without insisting on relevance. As night deepens in this telling, the image settles, a town with lights and fewer windows, streets that lead somewhere sometimes and nowhere other times, public buildings holding air, homes holding life. Nothing dramatic, nothing final. Towns that grew quiet without closing demonstrate a form of resilience rarely celebrated. They survived not by expanding or defending, but by accepting less noise, less reach, less certainty. And in that acceptance, daily life remained possible, familiar, and steady enough to continue without explanation. The town did not end. It learned how to be background. And background, in uncertain times, is often the safest place to remain. Baths that cooled without ceremony. Roman bathhouses did not fail suddenly. They did not close their doors in protest or crumble under dramatic neglect. They cooled, slowly, predictably, almost politely. What had once been among the most coordinated systems of urban life simply became harder to justify as effort grew more valuable than comfort. Heat, after all, is not free. It must be gathered, carried, tended, and renewed. When coordination thinned, warmth became selective. Baths had always depended on systems larger than the building itself. Aqueducts delivered water in steady volume. Forests supplied fuel in quantities that assumed organized transport. Labor kept furnaces burning and channels clear. None of this was mysterious. It was logistical, and logistics are fragile when authority becomes inconsistent. Without centralized oversight, small failures stopped being repaired promptly. A delay here, a shortage there. Heat lingered less reliably, and people noticed without needing explanation. The first change was not absence, but uncertainty. Water still flowed, but not always warm. Furnaces still burned, but not continuously. Bathers arrived unsure of what they would find. That uncertainty altered behavior more effectively than any decree could have. People prefer reliability over luxury. When warmth could not be counted on, attendance declined naturally. The bathhouse did not empty. It thinned. There is mild irony in how little drama accompanied this shift. Roman baths had once been social theaters. Conversation echoed, steam softened boundaries. Routine visits structured daily schedules. As heat became intermittent, visits shortened. Lingering felt unnecessary when comfort was no longer guaranteed. People adapted by adjusting expectation rather than demanding restoration. Late-night history lingers on this restraint because it reveals how systems fade when they stop justifying their cost. Fuel was the quiet decider. Maintaining heat required steady wood supplies. As long-distance distribution weakened, wood became precious locally. Burning it for baths competed with cooking, heating homes, and artisanal work. Priorities reorganized themselves without debate. Warmth moved closer to necessity. The bathhouse lost its place in the hierarchy, not because it was disliked, but because it was optional. Water systems followed a similar logic. Aqueduct maintenance required collective effort. When fewer people depended on baths daily, fewer people prioritized that maintenance. Channels clogged, flow weakened. Repairs happened only where water served multiple purposes. Bathhouses lost redundancy first. This was not neglect. It was triage practiced quietly. Bath attendants adapted before baths closed. Hours shortened. Certain rooms went unused. Cold pools remained functional longer than hot ones. Tepid rooms became the norm rather than the transition. The gradient flattened. Visitors adjusted without complaint. They washed quickly. They did not linger for warmth that might not arrive. The ritual simplified itself. No announcements marked this change. No one posted notices declaring the end of heated bathing. Customs do not require explanation when circumstances teach the lesson clearly. The bathhouse remained a building. It simply stopped behaving as before. That behavioral shift mattered more than structural integrity. There is understated humor in how this change would have confounded expectations of permanence. Roman baths were marvels of engineering. They seemed inevitable. Yet inevitability depends on continued investment. Once investment became inconsistent, inevitability dissolved. The baths cooled because effort moved elsewhere. Personal washing did not stop. It relocated. Rivers accepted bodies without complaint. Basins served households. Rain became useful again. Cold water returned to daily life without being framed as loss. People washed when and how they could. Cleanliness adjusted to conditions rather than ideals. Late-night history notices how quickly people relearn adaptability. Warmth had been appreciated, but it was never essential. The body remembers how to function without luxury faster than culture remembers how to explain it. The absence of hot baths did not destabilize life. It simply altered comfort. Bathhouses also required social agreement. Shared spaces demand shared norms. As attendance thinned, that agreement weakened. Fewer voices echoed. Silence replaced conversation. Large rooms designed for crowds felt oversized for small groups. The scale no longer matched use. People prefer spaces that feel proportionate. They drifted away. There is quiet irony in how bathhouses became victims of their own success. Their scale assumed abundance. When abundance receded, the scale felt excessive. Smaller practices proved more resilient. Washing at home required no coordination beyond the household. Rivers did not require fuel. Simplicity endured. Maintenance patterns tell the story clearly. Decorative elements deteriorated first. Mosaics dulled, paint faded. Functional elements lasted longer. Doors were repaired, roofs patched, furnaces neglected. This order reveals priority. Survival precedes pleasure. Late-night history respects this hierarchy because it appears repeatedly across periods. Some bathhouses lingered in partial use for generations. Cold rooms served purposes long after heated ones failed. They became places to meet briefly, to rinse, to exchange news. Over time, even these uses faded. The building did not protest. Stone remains patient when function departs. There is something calming in how this transition lacks grievance. No one demanded restitution for lost heat. No one framed cooling as injustice. The baths cooled because conditions changed. People noticed and moved on. That acceptance prevented bitterness from forming. Urban rhythm adjusted. Time once allocated to bathing returned to other tasks. Craft work extended. Household routines expanded. Evenings shortened. Warmth was conserved rather than spent publicly. Life reorganized quietly around new constraints. Late-night history allows this reorganization to feel natural rather than tragic. It shows how comfort recedes without taking dignity with it. People did not become less human because baths cooled. They became more attentive to where effort mattered. The baths also remind us that infrastructure reflects values only as long as values can be afforded. When effort becomes scarce, values reorganize. Warm communal bathing gave way to practical cleanliness. This shift did not erase culture. It simplified it. There is restrained humor in imagining someone arriving at a bathhouse, expecting steam and finding only cool water and echo. No outrage, just adjustment. Expectation lowered. Visit shortened. The body adapted faster than memory. Over time, vegetation crept in. Moisture lingered differently. Roofs sagged. Still, the buildings remained recognizable. Their shells stood long after their purpose faded. They became markers of a previous rhythm, rather than active participants in the present one. Baths that cooled without ceremony teach a subtle lesson. Systems do not need to fail dramatically to end. They can simply stop being worth the effort. When that happens, life does not pause. It reroutes. Late-night history appreciates this because it removes drama from decline. It shows how endings can be quiet, reasonable, and largely unremarked. The baths cooled. People washed elsewhere. No speeches were given. As night deepens in this telling, the image settles into stillness. An empty hall, cool stone, water no longer steaming, silence filling space once warmed by conversation. Nothing broken, nothing demanded. The bathhouse did not close, it cooled, and in cooling, it revealed how much of daily life continues without needing ceremony, explanation, or regret. Farming without imperial calendars. Farming did not stop when imperial calendars lost authority. It simply stopped listening to them. Fields do not recognize proclamations. Seeds do not respond to titles. Rain arrives when it arrives, and soil accepts labor only when conditions allow. After imperial scheduling faded, agriculture returned to a quieter relationship with time, one shaped less by expectation and more by observation. Under imperial administration, farming had been tied to projection. Planting schedules assumed coordination across regions. Harvests were counted in advance. Surplus was anticipated, taxed, redirected, and displayed. Calendars mattered because they synchronized effort at scale. When that scale weakened, synchronization became unnecessary. Local conditions replaced centralized timing without resistance. Farmers adjusted quickly, they always do. Weather became the primary reference again, not dates inscribed on stone or parchment. A cold spring delayed planting without penalty. A dry summer reduced yield without shame. Fields were worked when they were ready, not when someone expected them to be productive. This shift reduced anxiety. Expectations lowered to meet reality, which is often a relief disguised as loss. Tools tell part of this story. Under imperial systems, replacement had been easier than repair. Standardization favored new production. As networks thinned, tools stayed longer in circulation. Handles were reattached. Blades were sharpened beyond their intended lifespan. Improvisation replaced uniformity. A repaired tool may not look impressive, but it continues working, which matters more than appearance. Storage grew in importance as ambition softened. Instead of planning for expansion, farmers planned for continuity. Granaries were maintained carefully. Preservation mattered more than record yield. A smaller harvest that could be stored reliably felt preferable to a larger one vulnerable to spoilage or seizure. Security replaced growth as the measure of success. There is mild irony in how calm this adjustment appears. Imperial agriculture had often framed itself as progress, yet it depended on constant pressure. When pressure eased, farming did not collapse. It simplified. The land did not notice the change in authority. It responded as it always had to. Effort applied at the right moment. Late-night history lingers here because farming reveals how quickly systems revert to fundamentals. Without imperial calendars, farmers remembered older rhythms embedded in practice rather than policy. Frost lines, soil moisture, wind patterns. These indicators do not require explanation. They require attention. Attention returned naturally when external instruction faded. Crop choices narrowed without drama. High-risk varieties declined. Reliable staples dominated. Diversity remained, but it was practical rather than experimental. Crops that demanded precise timing or intensive coordination lost appeal. Plants that tolerated variation gained favor. Resilience replaced optimization. Ambition softened in ways that are difficult to frame as decline. Surplus was welcomed but not assumed. When it appeared, it was stored or shared locally rather than projected outward. When it did not, life adjusted without panic. This restraint conserved energy. Farming became less about maximizing output and more about minimizing failure. Labor patterns shifted as well. Large coordinated efforts gave way to household-scale work. Families tended plots they knew intimately. Knowledge localized. Decisions were made quickly because fewer people needed to agree. This reduced friction. Fields reflected the judgment of those who walked them daily. Seasonal rituals continued, but they were less formal. Without imperial reinforcement, celebration followed harvest rather than schedule. Feasts happened when food allowed. Fasting happened when it did not. Meaning adjusted itself to availability rather than expectation. This flexibility preserved morale. There is understated humor in how imperial calendars, once symbols of order, became irrelevant almost overnight. The sun continued rising. Rain continued falling. Crops responded as they always had. Authority had mattered less than it claimed. Late-night history appreciates how farming resists abstraction. It does not respond well to distant planning. It rewards presence. Farmers who paid attention survived better than those who followed outdated instruction. This was not ideology. It was practicality. Land use also shifted subtly. Marginal fields were abandoned. Fertile plots received more care. Expansion slowed. Consolidation followed. This reduced exhaustion. Overworked soil recovered. Yields stabilized at lower but more reliable levels. Stability became preferable to reach. Livestock patterns mirrored crop changes. Herd sizes adjusted to available pasture rather than projected demand. Animals were valued for multiple uses rather than single outputs. Flexibility mattered. A cow that provided milk, labor, and eventual meat was more useful than one optimized for a single purpose. Tools, animals, and crops formed smaller systems that could be managed without oversight. This reduced vulnerability. A failed harvest in one area did not necessarily cascade through the region. Local shortages were met locally when possible. Dependency decreased quietly. There is restrained irony in how imperial agriculture had promised security through scale, yet scale introduced fragility. When coordination failed, systems broke quickly. Smaller systems bent rather than snapped. Farming without imperial calendars proved less impressive but more durable. Knowledge transmission changed tone. Without formal administration, skills passed through demonstration rather than decree. Children learned by watching. Neighbors shared techniques informally. Variation increased, but so did adaptation. Fields reflected local intelligence rather than standardized instruction. Late-night history rests comfortably in this slow adjustment. It notices how farming reclaims time when pressure lifts. Days lengthen. Work follows light rather than schedule. Rest becomes possible again. Exhaustion decreases when expectation aligns with capacity. Weather regained authority without contest. Droughts were endured rather than explained away. Good seasons were accepted without extrapolation. Farming stopped pretending it could predict everything. This humility reduced disappointment. Storage structures became symbols of security more than granaries had ever been under imperial management. A full storehouse meant survival. An empty one meant caution. Neither required explanation. The presence or absence of food communicated clearly. Markets adapted accordingly. Surplus entered exchange when available. When it was not, trade narrowed. Farming and markets aligned in scale. Neither demanded growth from the other. This mutual restraint stabilized communities. There is quiet humor in how modern narratives often assume that losing centralized planning must produce chaos. Farming demonstrates the opposite. When centralized planning fails, local planning fills the gap quickly. Life continues with fewer promises and fewer surprises. Farming without imperial calendars also changed how time was felt. Years were measured by seasons rather than rains. Memory followed weather patterns rather than political milestones. History slowed down. Attention narrowed. This narrowing did not impoverish life. It made it manageable. Late-night history values manageability. It notices how survival improves when projection decreases. Farming returned to what it does best: responding, adjusting, enduring. The land did not demand explanation for the change. It accepted labor when offered. It returned yield when conditions allowed. It withheld when they did not. This consistency reassured farmers more than any calendar ever had. Over time, farming practices diversified regionally. Without imperial standardization, differences flourished. This variation reduced systemic risk. Failure in one method did not doom all. Diversity replaced uniformity quietly. Ambition did not disappear. It changed shape. Instead of expanding territory, ambition focused on maintaining household stability. A good year meant comfort. A bad year meant survival. Neither was framed as destiny. Both were expected. Late-night history lingers on this acceptance because it reveals a different model of progress. Progress measured not by expansion, but by persistence. Farming without imperial calendars embodies that model. As night settles into this telling, the image is simple. A field worked when dry enough. Seeds planted when frost recedes. Tools repaired by firelight. Grain stored carefully. No schedule posted. No authority consulted. Only attention applied steadily. This farming did not look backward in nostalgia. It looked at the ground. It listened to wind. It waited. In waiting, it found a rhythm that required less explanation and offered more rest. Farming continued because it always does. It adjusted because it must. Without imperial calendars, it returned to older agreements with time, weather, and effort. Those agreements held quietly, season after season, without ceremony, without projection, and without needing to be justified. Buildings too large to care for. Large buildings have a way of revealing their true cost only after the applause ends. In Roman Britain, villas built for elites were designed to demonstrate permanence, coordination, and control. They assumed steady labor, reliable materials, and a social structure capable of maintaining complexity indefinitely. When those assumptions weakened, the buildings did not protest. They simply became difficult. Villas did not collapse dramatically. They tired. Roof tiles slipped one by one. Wooden beams softened with damp. Heating systems that once required constant fuel and skilled attention were allowed to cool. Mosaic floors remained intact, long after rooms above them were no longer used. Decay here was gradual, almost polite. It respected the pace at which people withdrew their effort. Occupation became selective. Families did not abandon these structures entirely at first. They retreated inward. Rooms closest to warmth and light remained in use. Peripheral spaces darkened. Corridors became storage. Reception halls lost their purpose before they lost their walls. Life contracted toward what could be cleaned, heated, and repaired without help. This contraction was not framed as loss. It was adjustment. A building designed for display becomes inefficient when display no longer matters. Large roofs require constant attention. Long walls crack in many places at once. Windows multiply vulnerability. What once signaled success began to demand more than it returned. There is mild irony in how quietly this happened. Roman architecture had been explicit in its ambition, proportion, symmetry, scale meant to impress. Yet when maintenance thinned, scale became a liability rather than an asset. Grandeur faded into inconvenience without ceremony. Late-night history lingers here because these buildings teach restraint after excess. They reveal that architecture is not static. It negotiates daily with those who live inside it. When negotiation becomes one-sided, the structure loses relevance. Smaller buildings proved more adaptable. Simple roofs were easier to repair. Fewer rooms meant fewer decisions. Heating concentrated more effectively. Walls thick enough to hold warmth mattered more than walls long enough to impress. People gravitated toward spaces that responded well to limited effort. This was not a rejection of Roman building techniques. It was a reassessment of scale. The materials still worked. Stone still held. Mortar still bound. What failed was expectation. The expectation that large spaces could be sustained without the systems that created them. Villas had assumed surplus labor, surplus fuel, surplus coordination. When surplus receded, buildings that depended on it became burdensome. Smaller structures assumed constraint. They survived because they did not require abundance to function. Rooms were repurposed creatively. Bathing spaces became storage. Dining halls sheltered animals. Covered walkways protected firewood. The building did not dictate use anymore. Use dictated the building. This reversal marked a shift in authority from architecture to inhabitant. There is understated humor in imagining once formal spaces filled with practical clutter. Marble surfaces supporting tools. Decorative niches holding grain. Prestige became irrelevant when weather pressed in. Warmth outranked symbolism. Late-night history notices how little resistance accompanied this change. No records describe outrage at shrinking domestic scale. No lamentations for lost elegance survive. People did what they always do when conditions change. They occupied what worked. Maintenance decisions became pragmatic. A roof over a single room mattered more than preserving an entire wing. Repairs focused on immediate need rather than aesthetic coherence. This piecemeal care prevented total collapse while accepting partial abandonment. In some cases, villas transformed into clusters of smaller dwellings. Walls were subdivided, new entrances cut. The original plan dissolved into something more flexible. The building aged into a different identity without protest. Britain learned, slowly and without announcement, to stop repairing what demanded too much. This lesson was not ideological. It was experiential. Every failed repair reinforced it. Every successful small shelter confirmed it. There is restrained irony in how Roman architecture, once a symbol of order, adapted into something almost organic. It shed unused parts like a tree losing branches in winter. Survival did not require wholeness. It required adequacy. Late-night history rests comfortably with this idea. Adequacy is rarely celebrated. yet it sustains life. Buildings that can be fully cared for outperform those that promise too much. Public perception shifted subtly. Large abandoned structures did not provoke fear immediately. They became landmarks, shelter, sources of stone. Their presence remained useful even as their original purpose faded. Stone was reused carefully. Blocks removed from collapsing sections reinforced smaller homes. Material migrated from excess to necessity. This reuse was not vandalism. It was continuity practiced with restraint. Heating tells much of this story. Hypocaust systems required coordination across rooms. Fuel had to be sourced and distributed evenly. When that coordination faltered, heating retreated to hearths. Fireplaces concentrate warmth efficiently. They demand less infrastructure. People followed the heat inward. Lighting followed a similar pattern. Large windows lost advantage when glass was difficult to replace. Smaller openings retained warmth and reduced maintenance. Interiors darkened slightly. Comfort improved. Late-night history notices how sensory experience changed. Sound softened in smaller rooms. Heat lingered longer. Space felt more contained. These changes reduced strain. Large spaces amplify emptiness when underused. Small spaces feel purposeful. The social meaning of architecture adjusted as well. Hosting large gatherings became rare. Privacy increased. Domestic life narrowed. This narrowing did not isolate people entirely. It concentrated interaction locally. Villas that once signaled elite separation became impractical for isolation. People gathered where maintenance could be shared. Smaller compounds encouraged cooperation. There is mild humor in how prestige reversed direction. Owning less space became advantageous. Being able to care for everything you owned felt more secure than possessing impressive ruins. Late-night history lingers on this security. It recognizes that built environments reflect confidence. When confidence shifts from expansion to endurance, architecture follows. Some villas persisted as shells for centuries. Others collapsed more quickly. Survival correlated not with original quality but with adaptability. Buildings that allowed selective occupation lasted longer. Nature participated patiently. Plants entered unused rooms. Moss softened edges. This was not invasion, it was collaboration. The building adjusted to reduced human presence by sharing space. This gradual integration reduced visual drama. Ruins formed slowly. Walls leaned gently. Roofs caved in after long hesitation. Nothing here announced catastrophe. Britain learned to read buildings differently. Instead of symbols of authority, they became resources. Shelter from wind, orientation points, sources of stone and memory. Late-night history appreciates how memory persists without function. Even abandoned villas retained meaning as reference points. Their scale reminded people of what had once been possible without demanding replication. The absence of forced demolition matters. Buildings were not destroyed to make a point. They were left to reveal their limits naturally. This allowed reuse without erasure. There is restrained irony in how modern observers romanticize these ruins. At the time, they were not aesthetic. They were inconvenient. Beauty arrives later when urgency fades. For those living through the change, the priority was not preserving architecture, it was preserving energy. Buildings that consumed energy without returning comfort were abandoned first. Late-night history rests in this prioritization. It values decisions that reduce strain quietly. Architecture that survives is architecture that cooperates. By choosing smaller spaces, people reduce their exposure to weather, repair, and exhaustion. This choice improved daily life without requiring explanation. The process did not require planning committees or decrees. It emerged through repeated experience. Each winter reinforced it. Each failed repair confirmed it. Buildings too large to care for taught a lesson without instruction. Scale must match capacity. When it does not, contraction is not failure, it is intelligence applied belatedly. As night deepens in this telling, the image settles. A large villa stands partially occupied. Smoke rises from one corner. The rest remains quiet. Stones wait. No one feels compelled to fix everything. The building has become a resource rather than a responsibility. It offers what it can. It no longer demands what it cannot receive. Late-night history finds calm here. The refusal to maintain excess reduces anxiety. Letting go of unnecessary space allows attention to return to what matters. Britain did not forget how to build. It remembered how to choose. Choosing what to care for mattered more than preserving what impressed. In time, new buildings reflected this lesson. Smaller, thicker walled, easier to heat, easier to repair. Architecture followed lived reality. The villas remain as quiet instructors. They do not scold. They demonstrate. When systems fade, scale must follow. Grandeur without support becomes weight. And so these buildings faded into inconvenience without ceremony, not through violence, not through neglect, through a collective decision to stop spending energy where it no longer helped. That decision did not end architecture. It refined it. Smaller spaces survived more easily because they listened to human limits. Late-night history closes this section gently. Buildings endure when they are cared for. Care endures when it is possible. Everything else learns how to rest. The villas learned that lesson slowly. Britain learned it by living through them. And in that quiet adjustment, daily life continued, contained, warmer, and more manageable, without needing to explain why some walls were left standing while others were allowed to fall. Work that fed today and nothing more. Work in Rome did not vanish when the future became uncertain. It narrowed, it lost ambition, and retained necessity. Labor stopped pointing forward and began pointing downward, toward the present moment, toward the ground underfoot, toward hands that still needed to be fed. People worked, not because effort promised reward tomorrow, but because effort prevented hunger tonight. This change did not arrive with instruction. It arrived through repetition, through days that asked the same question again and again, and accepted the same answer quietly. Crafts that survived did so because they repaired rather than invented. Broken tools mattered more than new designs. Worn sandals required attention before ornamental ones. Roof tiles that leaked demanded skill sooner than decorative mosaics. Work learned to follow damage. Damage was honest. It appeared without metaphor. It could be touched, measured, and corrected. Ambition, by contrast, required belief in continuity. That belief had thinned. Innovation slowed without ceremony. No one declared an end to progress. It simply became inefficient. New methods require risk. Risk assumes surplus. Surplus had receded. Reliability gained value because it wasted nothing. A known technique, even if imperfect, preserved energy. Repetition became safer than experimentation. The city accepted this without debate. People continued to rise in the morning and apply effort. The act itself had not changed. The meaning had. Work no longer suggested advancement. It suggested maintenance, maintaining tools, maintaining walls, maintaining routines. These acts did not feel inspiring. They felt necessary. Necessity rarely seeks admiration. There is gentle irony here. Rome had once celebrated labor as contribution to something larger. Now labor contributed only to survival. The scale shrank. The dignity remained. In some ways it sharpened. Work done without illusion carries a different weight. It does not pretend to save the world. It saves the day. Artisans adjusted quickly. Blacksmiths repaired more than they forged. Potters reused clay when possible. Carpenters scavenged beams rather than shaping fresh timber. Nothing went unused twice if it could be avoided. Waste became visible again. When waste threatens survival, it stops feeling abstract. Labor also became quieter. There was no audience, no expectation of recognition. Work happened early and ended when fatigue insisted. Loud effort wastes breath. Quiet effort preserves it. The sound of labor softened into rhythm rather than proclamation. Skill replaced status. Titles mattered less than competence. Knowing how to fix something earned trust faster than claiming authority. People remembered who solved problems. Memory replaced credential. Reputation formed locally. It traveled slowly. Apprenticeship changed tone. Learning focused on what already worked. Masters taught preservation rather than expansion. The goal was not to surpass predecessors, but to match them well enough to continue. Excellence became consistency. Payment followed the same contraction. Wages varied. Sometimes they arrived as goods rather than coin, bread for repair, oil for stitching. Exchange felt flexible. Precision mattered less than fairness perceived through familiarity. Workspaces moved closer to homes. Long commutes offered no benefit. Tools stayed nearby. Labor integrated into daily life rather than separating from it. This reduced exhaustion. It also blurred distinctions between working and living. Women's labor gained visibility without proclamation. Food preparation, textile repair, child care, and household management fed survival directly. These tasks did not change. Their importance did. When survival narrows, foundational work becomes unmistakable. Children learned by watching rather than by formal instruction. They copied movements. They learned timing. They learned patience. Education aligned with utility. Abstract knowledge waited. Practical knowledge moved forward. There is quiet humor in how ambition evaporated without drama. People did not mourn careers they could no longer imagine. They adapted to tasks they could complete. Completion mattered more than trajectory. Work schedules loosened. Urgency diminished. No one rushed to outperform others. Speed increased risk. Care reduced it. Care prevailed. Even failure changed meaning. A mistake did not threaten reputation. It threatened resources. Correction mattered more than blame. This shifted attention away from pride. Work fed today and nothing more. Tomorrow remained uncertain. This uncertainty did not paralyze effort. It clarified it. Effort focused on what could be completed within daylight. Seasonal labor regained prominence. Harvest time demanded intensity. Winter required conservation. Work followed cycles older than administration. These cycles did not promise progress. They promised continuity. Tools aged visibly, repairs accumulated. Objects carried history through scars rather than polish. This visibility encouraged maintenance. A repaired object reminded its user of fragility. Fragility encouraged care. The absence of future promise reduced disappointment. When work expects little, it rarely feels betrayed. People measured success by meals eaten, not by milestones reached. There is something unsettling in how quickly humans adjust expectations. Remove the promise of advancement and effort does not vanish, it simplifies. Labor became intimate. People worked for people they knew. The abstraction of serving an empire dissolved. Service returned to proximity. This proximity enforced accountability more effectively than authority once had. Nightfall ended work decisively. Continuing after dark risked error. Error wasted effort. People stopped. Rest became strategic rather than indulgent. Stories about work changed tone. They no longer celebrated achievement. They noted endurance. Who lasted the winter? Who repaired the roof in time? Survival became narrative enough. The future still existed, but it lost magnetism. It stopped pulling effort forward. The present held effort in place. This anchoring reduced anxiety. Work did not inspire hope. It sustained breath. Breath sustained life. Life continued. Late-night history stays here because this version of labor feels both distant and familiar. Many people today work without promise, feeding today and nothing more. Rome reminds us this is not collapse. It is adaptation. The city did not stop functioning. It functioned differently. Work shrank to fit reality. Reality accepted it. Effort became humble. Humility conserved energy. Energy preserved survival. There was no grand ending to ambition. It simply fell quiet. In that quiet, work found its truest purpose. It fed today. And today, that was enough. Time without announcement. Time in post-imperial Rome did not disappear when authority weakened. It changed posture. It stopped standing upright and pointing forward. It began to lie flat, spreading quietly across the day, measured less by clocks and proclamations and more by light, shadow, and the slow insistence of fatigue. The city did not wake to trumpet calls announcing schedules. Morning arrived when brightness crept into rooms and bodies accepted that rest had finished. Evening arrived when exhaustion made further effort inefficient rather than heroic. Bells still rang, but less often and with less certainty. They marked habits rather than commands. Without a centralized rhythm enforcing alignment, time fractured into local patterns. Each neighborhood listened to its own cues. A street learned when to begin work by watching doors open. A household learned when to stop by noticing silence. Coordination shrank, but coherence remained. Appointments softened, they lost precision. A meeting no longer required exact arrival. It required eventual presence. This looseness did not produce chaos. It produced patience. Waiting stopped feeling wasteful when nothing urgent demanded replacement. People arrived when they arrived. Work adjusted accordingly. Seasons reclaimed authority quietly. Without institutions promising stability beyond weather, climate resumed its role as organizer. Summer extended daylight and labor followed. Winter shortened effort and conserved energy. Planning adapted not to calendars but to temperature and harvest. The future narrowed into manageable segments, defined by conditions rather than ambition. There is gentle irony in how anxiety eased alongside uncertainty. Anxiety requires projection. It feeds on imagined futures and missed deadlines. When the future stopped insisting on interpretation, mental space widened. People stopped rehearsing outcomes they could not control. Attention returned to what could be seen, touched, and completed. The day became sufficient, not abundant, not fulfilling in the abstract sense. Sufficient. This sufficiency reduced strain. People measured success by completion rather than by anticipation. If tasks ended before darkness, the day had worked. Time also lost hierarchy. There was less difference between important hours and ordinary ones. Morning did not promise advantage. Evening did not imply loss. Each portion carried similar weight. This equality softened disappointment. Public time weakened, private time strengthened, families synchronized internally rather than with the city, meals aligned with hunger rather than schedules. Sleep arrived when bodies demanded it. This responsiveness restored physical balance, long neglected. Children learned time differently. They watched shadows lengthen. They learned seasons by clothing changes. They learned patience by waiting for adults who no longer rushed. Education occurred within cycles rather than timetables. Records still existed. Dates were still written. But they mattered less than sequence. What happened before mattered more than when it happened. Narrative replaced chronology. Memory followed usefulness. Travel slowed accordingly. Journeys began when conditions allowed rather than when plans insisted. Delays were accepted without commentary. Commentary wastes breath. Acceptance conserves it. Time lost its voice. It stopped announcing itself. Without proclamations, it became background. Background time is easier to live with. It does not interrupt thought. It allows attention to settle. Work adapted to this rhythm. Tasks expanded or contracted based on daylight. Artificial extension felt unnecessary. Effort respected limits again. Exhaustion was signal, not challenge. Night regained clarity. Darkness meant stopping, not heroically pushing through. Stopping prevented error. Error wasted effort. Effort mattered more than appearance. Sleep deepened when it arrived without guilt. Guilt requires expectation. Expectation had loosened. Rest became strategic rather than indulgent. There is understated humor in how efficiently humans abandon schedules when they stop serving survival. Clocks had once symbolized order. Now they symbolized noise. People learned to ignore them politely. Time became local. One street might wake earlier, another later. This lack of synchronization reduced conflict. People stopped colliding over urgency. Festivals changed tone. They occurred when resources allowed rather than on fixed dates. Celebration followed abundance rather than announcing it. Joy became responsive rather than scheduled. Religious or civic calendars lost dominance not through rejection, but through irrelevance. When food determines rhythm, abstraction steps aside. Old people adjusted more easily than young. They had lived before clocks dominated life. Their bodies remembered slower measures. Their patience felt appropriate rather than outdated. The language of time softened. Fewer references to deadlines, more references to light. Morning, late afternoon, before dark. These phrases carried flexibility within them. Planning narrowed to necessity. Long-term projects felt impractical. Short-term completion felt achievable. This reduction did not impoverish life. It simplified it. The absence of future pressure reduced shame. Falling behind requires a standard. Standards had thinned. People judged effort by sincerity rather than speed. Memory also adjusted. People remembered sequences of days rather than dates. This blurred sharp edges. Trauma softened faster. Joy lingered quietly. There is calm in knowing that nothing crucial is scheduled beyond what the body can manage. Calm conserves energy. Energy sustains life. Time without announcement allowed listening. Listening to wind, to footsteps, to hunger. These signals replaced bells. Late-night history stays here because this version of time feels unsettlingly familiar. Many people today live by fatigue and daylight despite digital schedules. Rome simply acknowledged it openly. The city did not lose time. It lost performance. Time continued without commentary. When time stops demanding attention, attention returns to living. The day became enough. The night arrived without apology. Tomorrow waited quietly, without insistence. And in that quiet, people rested more deeply than any schedule had ever permitted. Political silence as background noise. Political life in post-Roman Britain did not collapse with noise. It thinned. Authority did not vanish overnight. It lost volume. Commands grew quieter. Responses became optional. Governance softened into something closer to habit than power. And this transition happened without ceremony, announcement, or clear moment of change. People did not gather to observe the end of administration. They simply noticed that fewer instructions arrived and that daily life continued without them. Britain did not replace Roman governance quickly. There was no immediate substitute waiting with banners or titles. Instead, fragments remained. A former official continued keeping records out of routine. A local landholder resolved disputes because someone needed to. Leadership emerged through familiarity rather than mandate. Power did not present itself as authority. It behaved as recognition. Silence filled the space once occupied by administration. This silence was not dramatic. It did not announce crisis. It did not provoke panic. It settled gradually like dust after movement stops. The absence of orders became noticeable only when people realized they had already adjusted. Roads were still used, fields were still worked, markets still opened. The machinery of governance had quieted, but life did not wait for replacement. There is mild irony in how little disruption this caused. Roman administration had once been loud with documentation, taxation, and visible structure. When it withdrew, what remained functioned surprisingly well at smaller scale. People relied on neighbors rather than proclamations. Disputes were resolved locally. Expectations narrowed to what could be enforced through presence rather than decree. Political silence became background noise. It was not emptiness. It was the sound of wind moving through systems no longer maintained. People noticed it occasionally, usually when remembering how things used to work. Then they returned to immediate concerns. Memory did not demand restoration. It accepted adjustment. Local leaders emerged without ceremony. Some were former soldiers, others were landowners, some were simply respected elders. None required formal recognition to act. Authority operated through repeated interaction. Someone who settled one dispute was asked to settle another. Power accumulated through usefulness rather than title. This informality reduced resistance. There was little reason to oppose leaders who did not claim more than they could enforce. Ambition softened. Control was expensive. Cooperation was cheaper. The absence of centralized power encouraged restraint. Silence also removed spectacle. Political life stopped performing. Without public rituals of authority, governance became quieter and less visible. Decisions happened in conversation rather than assembly. Outcomes mattered more than justification. The lack of replacement administration did not imply lawlessness. Norms persisted. Custom carried weight. Expectations survived because they were familiar. Roman law faded, but order remained through habit. People learned quickly which voices mattered. Loudness did not correlate with authority anymore. Reliability did. Someone who showed up consistently held influence. Someone who disappeared lost it. This recalibration altered social tone. Fear decreased. Without distant authority, consequences felt closer but less absolute. Punishment was negotiated. Mercy became practical. The silence of governance also reduced pressure. No census demanded accounting. No tax collector appeared unexpectedly. Obligations simplified. People owed work to people they knew, rather than to institutions they could not see. There is understated humor in how efficiently complex systems dissolve when maintenance stops. The empire had required constant reinforcement. When that reinforcement ended, what remained was smaller, quieter, and often more functional locally. Political silence allowed listening. Communities paid attention to conditions rather than policies. Weather mattered more than decrees. Harvest mattered more than law. Without centralized direction, coordination decreased across distance. This did not bother most people. Their lives rarely extended far beyond local geography. The empire had imagined unity. Daily life preferred proximity. Former Roman spaces adapted. Basilicas became meeting halls. Forts became settlements. Authority was repurposed rather than destroyed. The language of power changed. Fewer proclamations. More requests. Fewer threats. More persuasion. Persuasion requires relationship. Relationship slows action. Slowness prevented excess. Violence did not disappear, but it localized. Conflict resolved quickly or lingered quietly. Large-scale enforcement became impractical. This limitation discouraged escalation. Political identity blurred. People stopped defining themselves through empire. They defined themselves through place, village, family, trade. The absence of administration also removed illusion. Roman order had suggested permanence. Its silence revealed contingency. This realization did not paralyze society. It grounded it. Silence allowed forgetting. Forgetting reduced resentment. Resentment requires memory. Memory faded without reinforcement. Records decayed. Archives closed. This loss did not feel tragic. It felt distant. The future did not require documentation of the past. Children grew up without knowing imperial authority personally. For them, silence was normal. Normality does not feel like loss. Local justice emerged pragmatically. Disputes ended when exhaustion outweighed grievance. This was not ideal, but it was workable. Political silence also redistributed responsibility. Without distant rulers, people could not outsource blame. They adjusted behavior accordingly. There is gentle irony in how order survived without being ordered. Structure emerged from repetition. Silence allowed it. The background noise of absent authority became familiar. People stopped noticing it. Absence loses meaning when it persists. Late-night history lingers here because this silence resembles modern moments when systems fail quietly. Life adapts faster than narratives. Political silence did not create freedom. It created manageability. Manageability sustains survival. Power without volume is easier to live beside. Silence became a companion rather than threat. The empire did not fall loudly in Britain. It faded into background noise. And in that quiet, people continued living, adjusting authority to fit the scale of their days. This endurance required no announcement. It required only acceptance. Silence remained. Life filled it. And that was enough. A province that stopped pretending. Britain did not experience itself as fallen. That word belongs to hindsight, to maps drawn later, to narratives that require drama in order to feel complete. The people living through the change did not wake up one morning and announce the end of a province. They woke up, noticed what still worked, and continued. What disappeared was not identity, but pretense. Britain stopped acting as something larger than it could realistically sustain, and in doing so, it remained livable. Roman Britain had once operated as part of an enormous system that demanded coordination, projection, and belief in continuity beyond the horizon. When that system softened, Britain did not mourn its role within it. It simply narrowed its focus. Identity moved inward, from empire to region, from region to settlement, from settlement to household. This narrowing did not feel like loss. It felt like clarity. A province does not need to imagine itself as important in order to survive. Importance requires recognition. Survival requires function. Britain learned this distinction quietly. Roads were still walked. Fields were still worked. Homes were still repaired. The absence of imperial scale did not prevent daily motion. It reduced expectation. Reduced expectation eased strain. Villages became the primary unit of meaning, not because ideology demanded it, but because geography encouraged it. Most lives had always been local. Empire had stretched imagination farther than daily reality required. When that stretch relaxed, life aligned more closely with experience. People recognized faces more often than titles. Recognition replaced abstraction. Households strengthened, not emotionally in a romantic sense, but practically. More activities happened closer together. Meals mattered, storage mattered, shared labor mattered. The household became the most reliable institution available. It required no permission and offered immediate return. Inward focus was not nostalgic. It was efficient. Britain did not attempt to replace Rome symbolically. It did not erect new monuments to assert continuity. That urge belonged to central power, not peripheral survival. Instead, existing structures were reused without explanation. A bathhouse became storage. A villa became housing. A forum became an open space that no longer asked to be understood. These changes did not signal disrespect. They signaled adaptation. There is gentle irony in how freedom arrived disguised as limitation. Without the obligation to perform provincial importance, Britain could rest. Administration had required constant affirmation. Without it, silence spread. Silence removed pressure. Pressure removal allowed endurance. People did not describe themselves as post anything. They described themselves by work, kinship, and place. Farmer, smith, mother, neighbor. Identity shrank to what could be verified daily. Verification is calming. It reduces doubt. This shift also altered memory. Roman identity faded not because it was erased, but because it was no longer reinforced. Without rituals, memory softened. Soft memory does not demand loyalty. It allows coexistence with present needs. Britain did not rebuild its future in grand terms. Planning remained short. Next season, next harvest, next repair. This limited horizon reduced disappointment. Disappointment requires expectation. Expectation had thinned. The province survived because it stopped projecting narratives that required resources it no longer possessed. Projection is expensive. It consumes attention. Britain conserved attention by focusing on what could be touched. Local differences increased. One village resembled another less. Uniformity had belonged to empire. Variation belonged to survival. This variation did not threaten cohesion because cohesion no longer depended on sameness. Authority adjusted accordingly. Leaders did not claim permanence. They handled situations and then stepped back. Power became situational rather than structural. This flexibility prevented overreach. There is quiet humor in how efficiently Britain shed symbols once they stopped functioning. Titles went unused, offices went unfilled, the sky did not fall, the ground remained. The absence of imperial identity also reduced comparison. Britain no longer measured itself against distant standards. Without comparison, dissatisfaction lessened. Enough became enough. Children grew up without inheriting provincial anxiety. For them, the world had always been this size. Normality is defined by repetition, not history. Their normal required no empire. Trade adapted. Local exchange dominated. Long-distance trade became rare, but not mourned. Desire aligned with availability. This alignment reduced friction. Religion, where present, localized as well, but belief is not required to explain this transition. What mattered was habit. Habit survived. Britain did not romanticize endurance. It practiced it. Practice does not require language, it requires repetition. The land itself encouraged this shift. Britain is not vast. Its geography supports locality. Empire had overlaid abstraction onto terrain. When abstraction lifted, terrain remained. Silence followed. Silence does not erase life, it reveals it. Without imperial noise, everyday sound became audible. Wind, tools, conversation. Silence was not empty, it was spacious. There was no ceremony marking the end of pretense. Pretense fades when effort outweighs reward. Britain simply stopped pretending. This stopping did not involve choice in the philosophical sense. It involved adjustment. Adjustment is quieter than decision. Rome had required belief in continuity beyond lifespan. Britain now invested in continuity within it. This change reduced anxiety. Structures that once demanded reverence now demanded maintenance. Maintenance is more honest than reverence. It keeps things usable. The idea of province lost meaning. Place gained it. Place does not need explanation. History later called this decline. At night, it feels like rest. Britain did not fall out of empire. Empire fell out of Britain. The difference matters. Without pretending to be more than it was, Britain became exactly what it needed to be: livable, enduring, quiet. Late night history lingers here because this moment resembles many others. When systems grow too large, survival shrinks focus. There is no lesson required, no warning issued. The province that stopped pretending simply continued. That continuation did not announce itself. It did not seek recognition. It lived, and living without pretense proved sufficient. When empire faded and life continued. Britain did not mark the end of Rome. It simply noticed that Rome had stopped arriving. Roads remained, buildings stood, fields still asked for attention. Daily life outlasted imperial structure because it never depended entirely on it. In the late hours, this adjustment feels calm rather than dramatic. No announcements were required. No ceremonies were planned. The landscape absorbed the change without commentary, like stone cooling after a long day. People woke as they always had. They tended land that no longer belonged to an idea, only to use. Habit proved stronger than allegiance. Routine carried more weight than memory. At night, empire feels strangely loud in retrospect. It required belief, repetition, and constant reassurance. Life required far less. It asked only for light, shelter, food, and proximity. When authority softened, anxiety softened with it. Planning shortened. Expectations narrowed. The future stopped demanding interpretation. This was not resignation, it was relief. There is a quiet irony in how endurance looks like retreat from a distance. Nothing collapsed, nothing needed replacing. What disappeared was the performance of permanence. Britain did not become smaller. It became accurate. Villages mattered, households mattered, skills mattered. People lived among roads and walls without asking them to explain themselves. The past stayed present as material, not instruction. Late-night history lingers here because it sounds familiar. Systems fade, people adjust. Life continues. The empire left quietly, without farewell. The province remained, doing what it always had, feeding, sheltering, repairing, and sleeping. No monument marks this moment. It rests instead in the steady fact that when power withdrew, living did not. Listening to this, nothing asks you to remember. It only asks you to notice how quietly survival prefers to arrive, without permission, without applause, and without needing to be named before sleep finally settles in fully.